Good afternoon, all. I'm Jacqueline Matsupi with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, and I'd like to thank you for attending this year's Virtual Sustainable Transportation Forum and Expo. As you may know, the forum is collaboratively organized by the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, the Tennessee Department of Transportation, and the Tennessee Clean Fuels Coalition. The forum typically takes place as an annual conference where attendees share and discover projects that can reshape what is possible in transportation and mobility. In 2020, the Sustainable Transportation Forum and Expo is being held as a free online webinar series that promotes research, technology, planning, and policy developments that improve the transportation efficiency, reduce vehicle emissions, and address the mobility needs of all. We are so thrilled by this year's virtual turnout, which is a testament of the interest and commitment to these topics in our great state. Today's webinar on resiliency in transportation is the third entry in the 2020 virtual webinar series. Our moderated discussion with our expert panelists will examine sustainable transportation resilience through the lens of climate adaptation, cybersecurity, transportation planning, and more. As a reminder, this webinar is part of the Forum's 2020 virtual webinar series discussing today's most pressing sustainable transportation topics. For your convenience, we've put the registration information for the last session in the chat box. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few WebEx housekeeping items so that you know how to participate in today's webinar. You are all muted upon entry and will remain muted throughout the webinar to reduce background noise and associated audio feedback. We've also deactivated audience cameras to help with webinar bandwidth. To submit a question for Q&A, which will follow today's speaker presentations and moderated discussion, you can submit written questions into the chat box to our WebEx host, Mr. Caleb Powell. You may submit these questions via the chat box at any time during the webinar, and Caleb will hold all questions until the Q&A session begins at the end of today's presentation. We're also pleased to announce that each of our webinars are eligible for an hour-and-a-half credit with American Institute of Certified Planners. AICP members may track their credits through APA's CMlog. If you have questions, please contact Susan Strettenhagen at tn.gov. Susan is spelled SUSAN.STFENHAGEN at tn.gov. This email and information will also be in the chat box for your convenience as well. All right, so now that we're oriented to the format of the day, we thought it'd be fun and engaging to kick off the conversation with a lightning round of a couple quick poll questions using Mentimeter. For those that haven't used this platform before, it's very easy. It's just a three-step process. You can go to Menti, spelled M-E-N-T-I, menti.com, in a new web browser window or on your phone, and enter the code at the top of the screen that you see and answer the poll question on your computer screen. So I'll give you guys a couple moments to log in. The first question is, where are you joining us from? The options are traditional office, home office, kitchen, dining room, table, shed, porch, yard. It's a beautiful fall day, coffee shop, a temporary workspace, car, or other. So it looks like home office is winning right behind kitchen and traditional office. We've got a lot of people, and some are joining us from their car. Hopefully you're hands-free this afternoon while you multitask. All right, so the next question. What is your background or role? The options are citizen, activist, interested person, local regional government or state government, student, professor, researcher, nonprofit, consultant, other private industry, or other. So we've got a lot of state government, and a lot of local government. All right, on to the next question. What are you most interested in hearing about today? Answer as many that are applicable. Cybersecurity and transportation, transportation resiliency for extreme weather, alternative fuels, advanced vehicle technologies, transportation resiliency as it relates to freight and fuel, funding opportunities for resilient development, challenges and priorities for current and future transportation resiliency, and virtual services, accessing jobs resources from your home. All right, got a lot of interest areas. It looks like challenges and priorities for current and future transportation resiliency seems to be a strong winner, right after transportation for extreme weather and alternative fuels. All right, that's good. That's a good backdrop for our conversation. And then we have one last question. What is your typical mode of travel? Walking, biking, transit, micromobility, shared mobility, like shared scooters or rideshare, personal car or carpool, grounded by the pandemic and staying at home. All right, we've got a lot of car and carpooling, followed by folks staying at home. All right. Well, thank you for your participation in those poll questions. Your answers provide a good backdrop for our conversation today. So, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our moderator today, Ben Bolton, with TDEC's Office of Energy Programs. Ben administers the Tennessee Office of Energy Programs activities under the U.S. Department of Energy, DOE, funded state energy program addressing energy security, assurance, critical infrastructure, and energy policy. Those are a lot of big, broad brushstrokes. Ben serves as the state's lead emergency services coordinator for energy and currently as the infrastructure branch chief for Tennessee's COVID-19 response. Since 2018, Bolton has served as the co-chair of the National Association of State Energy Officials, NASIO, Energy Security Committee. Ben is a graduate of Birmingham Southern College with a BS in biology and a BA in English, an eighth-generation Tennessean. He lives currently in Nashville. Ben, welcome, and the floor is yours.
You might be muted, Ben.
Ben, we can't hear you.
There we go. Let's try that now. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jacqueline. I apologize for putting it on mute. I was trying not to get too excited, but I guess I did. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was great to have those survey results to help inform what the audience is and what you're interested in, and really excited to have this panel before us today of excellent speakers and subject matter experts in this. With 61% of you in state government and the rest joining us as well, I think you will find all these topics very relevant to what you're doing and what we need to know as far as transportation. Today is day 244 of being activated since the tornadoes hit Nashville back in March, and Middle Tennessee also. One of those ones that a good example of resiliency in transportation and how one of the things that happened after the tornado that's very relevant to transportation is I ended up helping coordinate TVA and DOT TDOT did the work, but we had a major transmission line fall down over I-40 just near Mount Juliet and the exit there. And it was an immense amount of cooperation and coordination. It went off without a hitch, but lots of coordination to stop the interstate, use helicopters to restring the transmission lines with TVA and make sure flight paths were clear, but all things that during an emergency necessarily you don't even see happening behind the scenes. As I like to tell somebody, when I'm doing my job the best, you don't know it's happening. But the pandemic, the tornado found us doing things we haven't done before and trying to respond to it in some respects. But then right after that, a few days later, we discovered there was this thing we're all have gotten used to, but still not used to, the pandemic. And that has found us, from an energy standpoint, found us in an unprecedented place, in that we had a fuel surplus. We had so much fuel, as I was mentioned to Jacqueline earlier, that we had fuel sitting in pipelines all across the country that we couldn't get rid of because everybody stopped driving for a little while. And even to this day, gasoline demand is still 15% below normal. So price of oil still remains lower than it's been in years. Looks like it's probably going to stay that way for the next couple of years, frankly. So enjoy those low oil prices at the pump, but that has created some new challenges. But we've also seen ransomware attacks in critical infrastructure and cities with water systems and healthcare systems and hitting all kinds of different areas. So this panel today tries to tackle some of those questions and how these folks are using their knowledge and their skill sets to help address some of these important topics. So what I will do is briefly introduce each speaker. You can find their detailed bios online in the comments. And what I will do is just briefly introduce them and let them go, because you want to hear from them, not hear me go on and on about how wonderful they are. But I will start first with Tiffany Rad, who is the founder and CEO of Anatrope Incorporated. They develop wireless automotive technologies for security and data analytics in the industry. She's an adjunct professor in computer science at University of Maine and also UC Berkeley. Excuse me, UNC is more what I'm used to. UC Berkeley, but she has also done pioneering work with Cisco. She's been featured in many media appearances, the Post and PR, as well as one of my personal favorite details, because I was a big fan of the series. Some of her industrial control research was featured in the USA Network series, Mr. Robot. But with that, I will turn it over to Tiffany so that she can tell you about cybersecurity and transportation.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Very good to virtually meet all of you. And as mentioned from my background, I do cybersecurity in different realms. Industrial control systems are one of the things where I did some work. It had to do with the way that things are connected to jails, brakes on trains, things that are related to infrastructure. In particular, as it relates to transportation, as I'm discussing today, there are some traffic lights, as many of you know. They're very expensive ones. I mean, I think some of the ones that I've seen that are industrial control system controlled are around the White House. They're very important for when the president needs to travel, but there are others in the country that are like that too. But my background, I got into cybersecurity by hacking cars. And one of the things that was exciting for me to take a look at was what we can look at from how can our cars connect to the infrastructure. What kind of signals can I see when I take a look at the car in the radio spectrum? And as I've been doing this now for about 15 years, looking at car computers and accessing them. So I do what's called red team work. So I'm often hired to break into systems so bad people can't break into the systems. The slide that you see right here is kind of the way that some things look like to me when I'm looking at this. So I put on kind of my offensive hacker hat and I take a look at what might the bad guys try to do to disrupt the transportation that we have. Can they hack individual cars? Can they hack from the cars to some of the infrastructure, such as the roadside units that are becoming quite more prevalent than they were 10 years ago when I started doing this research? And then are those connected through other types of networks to places where they can hack into, other types of government systems. One of the ways that I've seen some problems with this transportation infrastructure is where in some towns there isn't as much segregation between the networks. So if for instance, the police station sees DDoS attacks where a lot of different systems attack their network, sometimes there can be problems associated with 911, other types of emergency response, and also it can, in some towns, has affected even the traffic lights. So the transportation is affected by this type of malicious cybersecurity activity as well. Of course, ransomware is something I can talk about, answer some questions regarding that. But some people might think of all the attack work that I do on these types of systems that I might not want to see autonomous vehicles, but this is one of the things with resiliency I think that's coming up in the future too, is I'm actually very excited about autonomous vehicles, and this might be very small print on this slide, but it does make transportation safer. But what we need to do for resiliency and sustainability is make sure that, as we go from, there's some vehicles now with assisted driving technologies, but as these things start connecting to the roadside units and the rest of the networks associated with transportation, we need to be very, very careful about the cybersecurity that's implemented for these. And as part of it, and I'll answer some of these questions later today, but education for the Department of Transportation is super important for cybersecurity education. I've been working on a project like that with the U.S. Department of Transportation, working with regional transportation agencies to find out what they need, what would help them become more resilient to different types of cyber attacks that'll affect our transportation infrastructure. But again, looking at how these vehicles seem like they're radiating these radio signals out, this is how a bad guy could look at this as well. So I also encourage those of you that work in the transportation industry, there are different types of skill sets when you're hiring people to do cybersecurity for your state and local transportation agencies. And those that might have some backgrounds in cybersecurity, that might look like they have taken some classes related to hacking, have some certificates and things like that, they're definitely the kind of people that would be great for you to hire because they think a little bit differently than the build-it engineers. These are the break-it type of people, and you want to have both on your team to become more resilient for what's up and coming. And this is what I teach my students at UC Berkeley and also at University of Southern Maine. So, I'm looking forward to talking to you all about how I look at the transportation infrastructure and some of my recommendations I might have for becoming more resilient as more autonomous and connected vehicles are added to our roadway system. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. And I know that's a real abbreviated presentation, and we're going through just each speaker is going to do a short little intro to sort of what they do. And I will plug one of our TCAT colleges in Shelbyville actually has a really great cybersecurity program that has been competitive nationally with several Capture the Flag and other competitions, and does help certify good hackers, and is a great program that's getting great placement, working with the state in several different projects to help us better prepare and secure our own networks. And with that, so as we talk about some of the threat landscape to transportation, then it only makes sense to also get into one of the things that we all are dealing with, as we had in some places our first Frost last night. Next is going to be Andrew Joyner, who's the Associate Professor from the Department of Geoscience and Director of Geoinformatics and Disaster Science Lab at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City. And he is also developing the Tennessee Climate Office, as well as currently serving as the acting state climatologist at the moment. And he is going to talk to us a little bit about what they do and the products that they produce related to the weather and transportation. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Joyner.
Thank you, Ben, for having me today. I'm really excited about this. As you mentioned, I'm the director of the GADS lab at ETSU and also the acting Tennessee state climatologist, which why I have the asterisk there. Some potential news, hopefully this week, maybe as early as this week or next week, we should have official recognition for the State Climate Office from the NOAA National Centers for Environmental Information and the American Association of State Climatologists, which will be huge. We're one of only 2 states currently that do not have an official State Climate Office, but we have been functioning as the Tennessee State Climate Office for the past 3 to 4 years. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Of course, I think from my perspective, looking at hazards, extreme events, and climate trends, I think those are pretty important to sustainability and resiliency, so really good for the topic today. Here, real quick, you know, some of the big things we do as a climate office is just look at how departures from normals by the month, by season, by year. We're warmer than normal, cooler than normal, wetter than normal, drier than normal. Where are we seeing events, and where are we seeing some of these long-term patterns over seasons and years, and what do they look like, and what kind of impact might they have. Some of the other things that we look at every month we release a climate report for the state where we show information about departures from normal. We also every week provide information for the U.S. Drought Monitor, and of course last fall, around about a little more than a year ago, back in September, October, we developed a flash drought here in Tennessee, and so it was a pretty rapid onset drought event, just like a flash flood. You can have flash droughts, and so we were monitoring that really closely and providing information to the U.S. Drought Monitor about where we were seeing those worsening conditions, possibly if they would even lead to wildfires. And we were actually contacted by the Weather Channel to do a short interview about that last October, which was really interesting. Of course, they were linking it back to the 2016 wildfires, which occurred as partly because of a severe drought situation in 2016. Luckily, last fall we didn't get as bad, but it was pretty rough. Also looking at various other types of events. These are some examples from February 2019. We also had a lot of flooding this past February in 2020. 2019, we saw some really bad mudslides, especially in our area of Tennessee, and so I may end up talking about that a little bit later in the session. Of course, Ben mentioned the tornadoes. Wanted to look at that in context. How severe were they relative to previous tornado events? Where did they occur? What were the impacts? We also, especially as part of the GADS lab, the Geoinformatics and Disaster Science lab, we do hazard mitigation planning, and so that's looking at all hazards. And so we just finished the Sevier County Hazard Mitigation Plan. It was approved by FEMA about 2 months ago, and it is now approved pending adoption. So we're really excited about that. This is a really comprehensive plan. This is just a few examples. We were looking at drought in Sevier County over time. When has it occurred? Of course, it played a big role in their wildfire there in Gatlinburg. Looking at big patterns too, average annual precipitation. There's a lot of a variety or variability in Sevier County. You get into the Smoky Mountains, you get a whole lot more rain than you do in the northern part of the county around Sevierville and where I-40 goes across there. Also looking at what are our extreme events. What would we expect for a 1% 1 hour extreme rainfall event? What would we expect from a 24-hour 1% extreme rainfall event, and how that kind of varies across space. And then looking at other things using GIS, looking at landslide risk, doing some modeling for that, and also wildfire risk, incorporating different things into those models. And so that's kind of what I'm here to talk about.
Thank you, Dr. Joyner. I really appreciate that great introduction into the work that you do. I know Sevier County appreciates all of that hazard mitigation work. I've been dealing more with the mitigation side of things myself, even now, and the flash drought I certainly remember, and that's a great group down in Sevier County that you're working with. I know a few of those folks myself. So next up, while we've talked about now how the weather and preparing for it, planning for it, and dealing with hazards has just sort of become a way of life, I think it's very fitting that then we follow up with Dr. Mark Apkowitz, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Vandy here in Nashville. He specializes in risk assessment, management, communication, and a whole slew of resiliency topics that I will let. Very award-winning. Is an author of Operational Risk and Management, a case study approach to effective planning and response. Book that I will personally recommend to folks and say it's definitely worth the time, and I continue to learn things from it. Along with that, he's the chair of the Transportation Research Board Committee on Extreme Weather and Climate Change Adaptation. He is going to talk to us about the work that they do with all the engineers that they have to help us prepare and understand all this extreme weather and how we can be more resilient in the structures and buildings and better design that we do. And with that, if we can, are we switched over to Dr. Apkowitz? Yes, there's his presentation. I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Ben, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the webinar this afternoon. I'm going to switch the lens a little bit into talking about some of the issues that Andrew just brought up and putting it into the context of how this affects agencies that have a role in making decisions to try to manage our environment in ways that address the types of climate we're experiencing now and what we might want to look at in terms of how these trends are going to affect us in the future. And I think it's pretty well focused on a number of the attendees at today's webinar, given the mix of government agencies and others that have that type of responsibility. Apologize for this slide in terms of its clarity, but the more important thing is to recognize that when we look at Tennessee and natural hazards, it's not just one homogeneous area. We actually have climate regions. And if you really start to think about it, we have multiple regions, and a lot of that has to do with the topography that we have in this state, with a much more mountainous terrain in the east and much flatter and hotter in the west. So when we do analyses of resilience as it relates to natural hazards, we're very mindful of the fact that we have to be quite aware that each of these climate zones really experience and exhibit different types of threats and consequences. The other thing I might add is that I did include the concept of earthquakes in the natural hazard domain, and we're all certainly aware of the threats that are more likely to take place on the New Madrid fault line here along Shelby County and up the Mississippi River. But probably unbeknownst to many people is that we do have a lot of seismic activity over in East Tennessee. In fact, I believe there was a 2.4 magnitude earthquake just last night. Fortunately, the severity of the types of tremors that we would be seeing over in this area are really relatively small compared to what might take place over here. In any event, what I wanted to point out is that when you look at natural hazards across all these climate regions and geological areas, and you start to think about all the threats that we have to encounter and that we need to manage, the list gets pretty lengthy, and it's quite broad in its impacts that range from what can happen with wind and with temperature and with precipitation, and some of the consequential impacts that type of weather will lead us into experiencing, such as landslides and rock falls and sinkholes, some of the freeze-thaw cycles that we see that disrupt the transportation system. And then, of course, the new kid on the block is wildfires. So that's another player in all this. And the point I'm trying to make is that when you look at this list and you look at the state and its climate zones, there isn't any location that's totally immune to natural hazard threats. It's really more a case of what among this list is more likely to take place and may take place with greater frequency or severity. So with that as a background, I want to sort of talk about how this plays out in terms of the transportation system. And you see a list here on this slide, just as sort of a Whitman sampler of some of the things that can happen. I mean, we've seen road closures and damages from flooding and landslides and mudslides. We've seen bridges deteriorate as they lose their structural stability because of erosion. We've seen plenty of destruction of embankments and slopes. It's harder to get around. One of the things that we've learned a lot from COVID is how much the supply chain is important to the way that we live as a society. And that can also be impacted by the types of events that I'm talking about here, where we can have sections of major roads, for example, that are out of commission for several months, such as what we had on I-40 several years ago near the North Carolina and Tennessee border. And then you can see some of the other items that go down the list here. On the right-hand side, you see the triple bottom line, economic, social, and environmental. And those are really the linchpins to the way we live as a society, but they're also embodied in the triple bottom line concept that I believe in when we talk about the concept of sustainability. Just very quickly, that's kind of the steady state we're in right now, but things are changing, and they're changing in ways that are going to really heighten our awareness and need to be cognizant of managing our organization to be more resilient in the face of these things. Temperatures are going to rise. That has both good and bad aspects to it. We may see warmer winters in places where we've had to deal with snow hazards, but by and large, the temperature rise is going to be mostly problematic for most of the state, especially given our location in the southeastern part of the country. Precipitation levels are, many people believe they would increase, but even if they don't, there's definitely a feeling that the intensities will increase. So we'll have a larger volume of precipitation taking place in a shorter amount of time, which also, its sort of sister effect is that we'll have larger and longer droughts in between, and then the winds are picking up and wildfires are increasing. So basically, we've gotten the message. We need to be aware and responsive, and the question is, do we want to be reactive or proactive? The other quick thing I wanted to point out is that when you take this viewpoint from an enterprise perspective, natural hazard resilience is just one of many different threats to a transportation organization or an environmental organization, and you need to think through not just what natural hazard threats are imposing on your system, but a variety of other things. For example, what Tiffany mentioned with regard to cyber attacks, and you see other items on this list. So we have to kind of juggle all this, make our priorities, but also recognize that certain resilience strategies may benefit reducing the risk associated with more than one type of threat. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to point out is that as daunting as it might look going forward, because the population is going to grow mostly in urban areas, we're going to have probably more socially vulnerable populations, more infrastructure will be developed. In many cases, if it's poorly planned, it will be in high-risk areas. As the population grows, they'll want more use out of and mobility out of the transportation system. They also will probably be very impatient with regard to how quickly we maintain the continuity of our system. But the good news is that a lot of our infrastructure has reached or has exceeded its useful life. And so it's actually an opportunity in that we have this window right now where, as we start to think about planning, design, construction, operations, maintenance of our transportation systems, we have the opportunity to incorporate resilience thinking and adaptation strategies into that effort.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Afrovitz. I think that's a good jumping point to start into the panel, and the panel loads up their video, and we'll get started into questions for them. And remember that you can submit chat questions to Caleb in the chat, and we will try to get to those. I have a slew of interesting things that I'm curious to hear thoughts on. I will add one of those supply chain things during the pandemic that's related to transportation that we certainly did not anticipate, but the glut of fuel created a situation where refineries stopped producing oil as much, which then, without having to need as much gasoline, because we weren't producing as much gasoline, which meant on the side we weren't producing as much ethanol for that 10% ethanol requirement, blending requirement that we need. When we didn't produce enough ethanol, then that meant the byproduct of that production is CO2 that's used for food production. And suddenly then the CO2 that was good, that we needed, that's used in helping with meat packing and also in hospitals and dry ice production, suddenly there was a shortage of CO2 in the country and caused issues with meatpacking plants for a little while. So that is just an example of how you pull one little thread in transportation when it comes to the fuel, and it led to all kinds of complications that we hadn't anticipated. And production is still almost back to normal, but not quite. And we're anticipating that, you know, as demand stays below normal, ethanol is still coming back slowly but surely. He already touched on sort of my first question, so I think that's the one I'm going to start with, in that you already addressed a lot of what are the greatest concerns and largest threats facing transportation and resiliency today, and then what are the biggest opportunities that we have. And I think touching on the infrastructure, where we are with our current condition of infrastructure, great example, the pipeline that serves 2/3 of Tennessee, most of Middle and East Tennessee, the Colonial Pipeline, was built in the 60s. It was the first major gas pipeline through the U.S., and it's continuing to be maintained, but it provides most of the fuel for the Eastern Seaboard. And there are lots of opportunities that I think in transportation and our infrastructure to improve the situation and see how we can do better and better. So I think with that, I'll start. Let's go back to Tiffany. And Tiffany, what do you see are the largest threats or concerns facing transportation and resiliency from your angle? I know you deal with threats on a very regular basis, so I'd be curious to your thoughts there. Make sure that we're all unmuted and set up.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Some of the biggest threats that I see about transportation is, as the other panelists have pointed out, has to do with the supply chain is a big one too. Without putting any like fear and uncertainty and that kind of scariness about cyber, and I don't like to look at things from that perspective, but kind of like we assume now when we open up bank accounts or credit card accounts that these things are going to get compromised. It's just as a matter of life right now that we will have we will have compromise of our data. What concerns me is that a lot of the systems that are related to, as you mentioned, the pipeline, the electrical grid, even with, as it is associated with transportation of trucks that are bringing food. There are organizations that are looking at some vulnerabilities associated with trucks and how they're bringing food to us, what they, would you be able to stop them, for instance, all at one point? Like one of the projects I looked at is New York City, not being able to get supplies into the city because someone had done, this is all theoretical, but the bridges and tunnels, you weren't able to enter, or they stopped the transportation into New York City at that point. So I look at some of these, some of the transportation risks with this in that perspective. So there are many professionals that are working on improving the cybersecurity associated with vehicles, with trucks, even pipelines, and the electrical grid. But I think similar to the way that we look at accounts, we know that the bad guys are already in these systems. So part of what we need to do for the resiliency is be able to detect them and train our employees. Training and education goes a long way. But being able to train people to identify some of these risks and be able to identify phishing attacks. You know, these are things that you can do. It's much more cost effective because it'd be easy for me to say for everyone for Department of Transportation, just upgrade all your systems, right? Just get the most expensive technologies, but that's not feasible for most states to do in that way. So one of the stopgaps you can do is do the training and then assess what your risks are. A lot of agencies that I talk to in transportation aren't really sure what kind of assets they have, who has access to these assets, and then being able to restrict access to only those who need to be able to access those systems. So these are things associated with training and management that can be done that are quite effective in lieu of putting in all kinds of new expensive technologies that, frankly, you may not need. You may not need, because education and training goes a long way.
All right, thank you very much. I think that's certainly very true with education and training. It's most of the time, most cyber, you look at some of the detailed reports of how major incidents has happened, it usually was one of us opened an email that we shouldn't have and clicked on a link we shouldn't have. So those are, you know, you that are listening today are the front line of good cybersecurity every single day. And that does go without saying. It's something that I try to repeat often, and remember to change your passwords and all those things that we constantly are heard. You know, the huge major grid outage in Ukraine all started from somebody opening an email that has been carefully tailored to them and was a spoof, and clicked on a link and they got some malware, and they are still trying to recover from it. But with that, I'll turn to Dr. Joyner. And Dr. Joyner, the same to you. What are the largest threats and concerns you think facing resiliency in transportation today, and some of the biggest opportunities?
I think from my perspective, certainly thinking about this in regards to climate, to extreme weather events, things that, you know, we've seen happen across the state, is really access to, you know, some of the threats is maybe a lack of data sometimes, or maybe use of older data or outdated data. Certainly from the goals of the Tennessee Climate Office, we want to provide data and data services, which are currently a little hard to find, and oftentimes you're looking at a lot of different resources that are all over the place, and just very difficult to navigate with. What data do I use to even assess my risk or assess my vulnerability? And so I think there's a real struggle, even in regards to looking at hazard mitigation plans. You know, hazard mitigation plans, if you look at those across the state, some are pretty good, and some, you know, aren't developed very rigorously. And it's not the county's fault for that. I think it's just a lack of access to data and knowledge of where those data come from. I think there's also that presents some opportunities. If you look just to our north in Kentucky, they have a wonderful what's called a mesonet, a system of weather stations across their entire state that is research grade, collecting data, you know, basically every second, and delivering that data to servers. Weather forecasters use that data. Their state emergency management agency uses that data. The local officials, emergency managers use those data, and we don't really have that same system here. So Kentucky has one of the best in the country. Oklahoma is another state that has a great really the original mesonet. And so that's something that we've actually discussed with Kentucky. How do we kind of work together on maybe initially getting some weather stations up on the Tennessee side that could also help Kentucky, so we could maybe partner together in funding some of these things. But getting access to better data, recording better data, and then using those to improve our risk assessments when we're thinking about transportation, when we're thinking about hazards, all of those things, you know, getting that up-to-date data, I think, is both a threat and an opportunity, and it will allow us to understand our local risk a good bit better. One of the things, and I think it may get into one of your second questions here, is, you know, if we can improve that information, there's lots of examples out there where improved or more recent information has changed how local officials even implement policy or write policy, building standards, those sorts of things. A great example is Hurricane Harvey in Texas, where you had a huge amount of rainfall, over 50 inches in several places. It's just an absurd amount that they had never recorded before, at least. Doesn't mean it hadn't happened before, but they've never recorded that and really didn't build for those. And so, you know, now they've got that information and they've reassessed their return periods. They've completely overhauled what their rainfall return periods were in South Texas. And, you know, what they were thinking was 1,000, what they call a 1,000 or 2,000 year event, very rare. Now maybe that's not such a rare event, or they don't think it will be going into the near or medium term. And so even with Nashville, with flooding in 2010, you know, how do we put these events in context? How do we plan better for these types of events as they may happen again? And I think there's one concept where I am planning where are you safe from failure or are you safe in failure? And so I think a lot of times we try to be safe from failure. We try to prevent things from failing at all, or try to say that, okay, if we do this, we build this levee here, we won't flood. But what happens when that levee does get breached? And are you going to be safe in that failure? And so I think that's something that has to be considered too. And better data, come back to that for me. Better data, better recording of data, and better leads to better assessment.
Thank you. I think that's very true. One of the things with Hurricane Harvey that they did learn, and I can say from behind the scenes, is I was part of a DOE exercise in Houston 3 months before the hurricane hit, and was really shocked to hear the planners talk about that they had, from previous experiences they had learned with Gustav down in Houston, and the way the water had drained and the data that they even had then before that event, they were not going to, there's a certain cutoff they had figured out. They would not then order evacuations because it endangered too many people being on the interstates during that time frame. And so because of how things drained and how they had learned before that there was a certain point time-wise that it was no longer good to advise folks to be on the interstate. And that was all data-driven. And so I know they are going back and revisiting all of that now that they have all the data from Harvey and the massive amounts of rain they got there. So that's certainly very true. And then there's the third one from that of data fatigue also. You know, we do update our data. We're constantly getting all this new data. And I know for government employees especially, it is trying to be that sieve and absorb the ocean of data when I've only got a bathtub to do it in. So, but with that, I'll go to the next question. I really appreciate all the good answers we had for that. I think it's a good perspective of the landscape and the different areas that this topic covers. But I wanted to, as the interest sort of showed at the beginning, switch now to more alternative fuels. And, you know, we're all getting aware of the contributions alternative fuels are changing the landscape. One of the areas that I talk about from energy assurance standpoint is alternative fuels help widen your portfolio. They make a community more resilient if you have emergency response vehicles or other vehicles that aren't purely gasoline fueled. If you've got EVs, if you've got natural gas or propane powered vehicles, then in that situation, which we will eventually find ourselves back in, where we have a fuel shortage, if you have alternative sourced fuels, then your community, your facility is better able to respond and maintain operations and function in that kind of situation. So along those lines, what are some other types of transportation-related technologies that you see can promote resiliency that maybe others aren't aware of, or some novel solutions that you think are available today that that this crowd that you have now of planners, TDOT, and other folks should hear about? And I think with that, I'll go back to Dr. Abelkowitz and let him start with that one.
Okay, thank you. Like in the presidential debate, people will often go back to the previous question and answer a little bit of that before they go on to the next one. So I'd like an opportunity very quickly to add to the discussion about the largest threats and concerns. At the very highest level, natural hazards and cybersecurity are definitely 1 and 2, and you can pick your order. So I commend the webinar planners for honing in on those. I think they are clearly the greatest resilience threats. It's Tiffany's area, but I do worry about the amount of automated traffic control and other devices that we're thinking about, autonomous vehicles and so forth. And cyber is basically at the root of being able to manage all those systems. So any kind of intervention that takes place there is of serious concern. And then getting to the natural hazard part, water and heat, flooding and temperature are going to be huge problems for Tennessee. Heat is sort of being underestimated in terms of how many days we're going to have above 90, 95 degrees by mid-century, what that impact has on the ability of the infrastructure to handle that type of heat, the ability of work crews to be out there, the kinds of environmental breathing problems people might have, et cetera. And the flooding has already been discussed by Andrew. As far as going to this next question about opportunities that are out there in mitigation space, I'm not as much of an expert in that, but I will tell you one of the things that we're doing with the help of TDOT through their CMAQ program is we're doing a lot of work right now at Vanderbilt looking at how to integrate transportation demand mobility so that you have a whole litany of different kinds of modes that are available, and you encourage people to start to get out of their single occupant autos, which obviously contribute significantly to carbon footprints, and to look at alternatives such as bicycling and walking and working from home and those kinds of things. And I think that the ability to be able to recognize that there are multiple options for people and to incentivize people to do those kinds of things can really make a big difference in terms of sustainability and resilience while still providing the kind of mobility that people are looking for. The other thing I wanted to point out is technology. We have essentially a living laboratory now at Vanderbilt and beyond through the assistance of both different programs within TDOT. There is an activity going on right now on I-24 to make that essentially a real-world sensing laboratory, if you will. We're going to be collecting all kinds of different data on how people move and their travel behavior and what kinds of ways we can use autonomous vehicles and other activities to be able to make the flow of traffic go more smoothly. And then closer to campus, we have a variety of different cameras that are up to measure air quality as well as travel mobility and so forth, curbside management in terms of who uses the curb at what times and so forth. And when you start to collect that much data, and then you start to use what we call machine learning, that basically you train the computers to start to say, okay, this is a scooter, this is a car, this is a bicycle. We can learn a lot more about how people move and why they do what they do, and essentially provide a much better environment for the sort of mixed use types of activities that we see going on in transportation all the time. Ben, you're on mute.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you for the answer, and we will go on then. Let's go back to Dr. Joyner, and same question to you with alternative fuels and other types of transportation-related technologies or other strategies that you see are new, novel, and solutions that we should hear about and inform the crowd about.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's not necessarily an area of my research, but it's definitely an area of interest. Personally, I'm very excited about all the different alternative fuel options out there, electric vehicles, those sorts of things, to kind of see where we go from here. Of course, Volkswagen being in Chattanooga and really being one of the larger automobile companies pushing for basically electrifying the entire fleet. Is pretty exciting for Tennessee. So we'll kind of see where that goes. I think locally, some of the discussions I've heard from researchers and from others is looking at some of the heavy vehicles, such as school buses, garbage trucks, and those sorts of things that have a home location every evening and could easily be electrified and also drastically improve air quality. And so I think, those are pretty exciting things. I think some of the potential issues out there, similar to when you have a major event, a hurricane, tornado, flood, where maybe you're cutting off fuel supply. How do people respond to that? How do people leave an area, or how do emergency responders get to an area? I think some of those issues will remain with electric vehicles and those sorts of things. If we lose power for days or weeks, how are we charging those vehicles? I think those are some things that we'll have to think through, and they're already being thought through by a lot of folks. And so I'm curious to kind of see where we go in that direction. But I'm really excited about that. I think there's a lot of opportunities there, but a lot of things to think through from impacts, kind of from the hazard side. What are the impacts from these types of hazards that we have seen and will continue to see on alternative fuels? How will the impact be similar to our current heavy usage of gasoline, to maybe an increased diversity of fuels for using some gas, some natural gas, electrification, those sorts of things? And then how are our how are our homes, how is electricity coming to our homes? I think that's something that a lot of people think of, but maybe is in the background for other people. How is electricity getting to our homes where we're charging these vehicles? Is it a sustainable form of energy? Is it a resilient form of energy? Or is it something that could have issues that we have already? And how do we address those? So those are things that I think about.
Excellent. There are two. One of the things that was exciting last week that was also announced is GM announced that the Spring Hill plant will be getting the Cadillac EV, and we'll be building the Cadillac EV right here in Tennessee. So that's another big innovation and automobile win for Tennessee. The other one that comes to mind was a speaker I heard last month of Beam Solar, and they have now produced a really innovative EV charging station that basically takes up one parking space and is enough to charge up to 6 different vehicles, but it doesn't tie into the grid. It's solar storage. And so that's for a lot of places that want to add EV infrastructure to their business or to even their office buildings, that's going to be a less invasive and more environmentally friendly way to do so through solar storage. And there are other exciting solar storage projects that we're watching in other states where some of the E911 centers are being positioned to do more of that same thing, because as we're seeing some of these bigger storms, we're seeing bigger risks as far as not having power and not having power outage. So that's kind of one of those alternative fuel things as well. And so lastly, I'll switch over to Tiffany, and the same question to you, probably not as much with alternative fuels, but could be. And that is, what are the other major innovations, transportation related, that you are seeing and novel solutions to it that we should hear about?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm very excited about autonomous vehicles. As we're moving towards stage 5 for autonomy, some automobile manufacturers think that they're going to hit that stage in the next year or two. What that means is you can literally be asleep behind the wheel and the vehicle will get you where you want to go. Some people believe we're at that stage now. In fact, I drove from Virginia to southern Maine yesterday in the rain the whole way, but I saw some electric vehicles where, I know they have some technologies built into these electric vehicles where people, it can sense if your eyes are not on the road or if you're looking at your phone. Recently, there was a privacy concern in Texas. A security researcher discovered that there's a camera watching you. So if you got your cell phone up when you're driving, especially in states like Maine and Virginia where it's illegal to pick up your phone when you're driving, but it's supposed to be able to detect that kind of stuff. But I saw some people driving that were not quite alert. So I'm excited about autonomous vehicles because I do a lot of driving, and my primary home base is in the Washington, D.C. area, where I would sometimes have to drive an hour and a half to get to where I wanted to go around the Beltway. It was terrible driving. So I'm very much looking forward to the autonomous vehicles, but I also have some reservations about them. One of the projects I'm working on currently, and I was actually down in Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge talking to some people during a hot rod convention that was huge down there. But I was talking to some people that were changing some of the chips in their cars, and some more so than others, and I did see some people with some electric vehicles. With electric vehicles, more so than just like carburetor type of vehicles, you put your body in a computer when you get into some of these new electric vehicles. And one of the concerns I have about that is the cybersecurity associated with that as well. There are some people that are changing a lot of things in their vehicles that related to not just horsepower and battery power for some electric vehicles, but they're taking out the entire operating system that was created by the automobile manufacturer. And that's concerning to the automobile manufacturers. The government's a little bit concerned about that, because what they do is when they have to go do, in some states, like a state inspection, different for electric vehicles, you don't have the same type of inspection you do for other cars that have emissions. But they put it back. So they'll take a copy of what it's supposed to look like. So when they go back in for their inspections, and for the hot rod community, this happens quite frequently. I saw some of this in Tennessee, but they'll reflash the chips so they can pass inspection, but then they'll just take it right back to where it was before. So obviously there's some environmental concerns with people doing that, but this has to do with the tuning and modification community for the vehicles. But what I am interested in, and I'm doing a project on as well, is up here in New England. There are some people that are completely removing operating systems from electric vehicles and putting their own in. What also is a worry about that is when these vehicles do connect to roadside units, maybe they're not going to get the notifications that, hey, there's an emergency vehicle coming, there's road work ahead. Like in one of the slides I showed you in Michigan, even 4 years ago, during a pilot, they were able to inform connected vehicles like there's road work going on, so slow down. And in some cases, it will make the vehicle slow, so take the control away from the driver. And I do think this improves safety, but if you have some vehicles out there on the road that are different than the others, it's concerning. And right now, the laws associated with prohibiting people from making these changes, it's kind of a gray area. So that's one of the things I look at. I'm excited for this technology, but I have my reservations about it as well, because it's going to be a bumpy road at first with how things go.
Certainly. Are there any good examples of states that have begun some regulations or prohibitions to modifying vehicles like that?
Well, let's put it this way. There is right now, this is more known in the car hacking community, but I think the car tuning and modification community knows this as well. Every 3 years, I think it's every 3 or 4 years, the Library of Congress gets together and they have hearings in Washington where if security researchers for good faith security research or right to repair type of things associated with, for instance, even tractors, farm tractors, like large commercial vehicles in a sense, they can tell the Library of Congress that they'd like this type of exemption from, believe it or not, copyright law prohibits people from making changes to their vehicle under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And the other one that is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. If you hack into a system and you don't have authorization to be there, you can trigger both civil and criminal liability associated with that. So I do the technical work, but also as an attorney, I look at these laws and as they're coming down the road and take a look at how that applies to the technology and the research that we're doing now. And so that's part of what I do too. Is there are more opportunities to access the vehicles, so it's kind of a toss-up. Do you want security researchers to be able to say, "Hey, we found these problems with the vehicle," but the flip side of that is there are going to be people that are going to be trying to claim some exemptions that may not be good faith security researchers.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I've seen some of those large tractors and the amount of that's gained by how much more automated those have become, and the crop yield benefit has been significant. So that becomes a significant risk, but a huge cost to those businesses if they are hacked or if they're modified. So I could see that becoming a big problem. Thank you for answering the follow-up. So with that, I'll switch now to the next question of interest. And do remember, if there are questions that you are interested in hearing from others, please go ahead and send those in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to just keep on with this excellent set of questions that folks with our office have prepared, and that is, field of resiliency and its relationship to transportation's evolved substantially in the last few years, as has everything else. I go back to one of the things none of us answered correctly was what we'd be doing in 5 years when it was 2015, because we're not doing that now. But throughout those careers, each of you have had great careers that have been diverse and gone in many different directions sometimes, but all led you to the expertise that you have now today sitting before us. So in those careers, what are some of the most significant or important changes that you have seen in resiliency planning and response within the transportation sector? And I think with that, let's go back to Dr. Afkowitz and start with you and your thoughts on some of the most significant changes you've seen.
Okay, Ben, I guess I got the short straw because I've been in this business the longest, which means I have to try to challenge my memory to some of those moments. Actually, I'm just going to hone in on two. One of them, which probably is pretty ubiquitous for people today, but the advent of geographic information systems, which I would like to say kind of got into its adolescence maybe 15 to 20 years ago, became a way of being able to take disparate data and have them all speak to one another through a common reference, which was essentially latitude, longitude, or some other acceptable geographical nomenclature. And when we were able to do that, we were able to start tying together transportation systems to where populations are located, to where hospitals are located, to where we have resources to be able to bring to bear on an emergency should it take place somewhere. Being able to put within the same GIS system all the data we have on how many people or how many products are being shipped on a particular segment or across a whole network. And so not only did we have the analytical capability to do that, but we also had the visual capability. So you could create these maps, and I really believe in that adage that a picture's worth 1,000 words. So that really catalyzed not only the ability for people to understand, but it also motivated a lot of agencies to start collecting data in ways that were GIS compatible, which only strengthened our ability to ask questions we didn't think we could ask and really promote a much more proactive way of thinking about problem solving. The second thing, more resilience-oriented, I think, has to do with, at least in my career, coming to the conclusion about 5 to 10 years ago, probably 10 years ago, that as much as we were going to try to mitigate our carbon footprint and try to turn things around without sounding too transportation-ish, the train had left the station in terms of there would be several decades of the consequences of not having done it sooner, and that we had to have a second equally important branch called adaptation. And as a result, I really started to focus very heavily on what can we do, knowing what we're experiencing now and will be experiencing, irrespective of how quickly we may or may not be able to turn things around. And how does that influence the types of engineering solutions that we might be able to come up with, but also other things that are probably even more important and not engineering oriented at all. How do we educate people about adaptation and resilience? I've seen cartoons, which I kind of like, where you'll have 12 people from an agency sitting around a table talking for the first time about resilience, and they each have a different definition. So they're talking past each other. So education is important. We have a project at Vanderbilt right now where we're trying to develop a risk education curriculum for high school students. And part of that is also just so that they have the ability to try to understand that, learn about it, know what questions to ask, because from a workforce development standpoint, we're kicking the can down the road in many respects, and they're going to be the ones that are going to have to really deal with much of this. And then what comes with that also is collaboration. No one owns resilience. It's a multidisciplinary, multi-agency problem. And so we really have to look across organizations, even across critical infrastructure systems, to try to sort through all this. And so what comes with that is a culture change. I mean, I'm not knocking any agency, but agencies tend to get complacent and bureaucratic over time. And this is a wake-up call. We really have to get out in front of this puppy, or we're always going to be chasing from behind. And then the last thing I think that came about from all this is courage. We have to somehow have the political will and courage for zoning boards to not allow people to build in high-risk areas. We have to have the courage and political will to say, we've bailed you out 2 or 3 times before, and we're not going to come and bail you out so you can put it back the way it was again. And if it's not good enough, then you should migrate. You should go somewhere else. Those types of courageous decisions are the kind of leadership that needs to come out of this. So, long-winded answer, but I think those are the 2 inflection points for me.
Oh, I don't think those were long-winded at all. I think, that's, you got the short stick because you were the first last time. But also I know that you've had a wide range of things to see, and I think starting from the engineering standpoint is a good way to do. It's I think building codes has been a good portion of that, and seeing how we went from all the way back to Hurricane Andrew in Florida, and then we've seen Florida be able to withstand hurricanes more because of building codes. Pardon me, a big proponent that building codes are about the best mitigation effort we have for in the world, because if we want to mitigate something out from the beginning, then if we build a better, smarter, better located building, then the chance of it surviving all these disasters, both natural and man-made, only increase. And so it's good planning and good design and good implementation is where that all begins. So with that, I'll go to Dr. Joyner, and same to you of throughout your careers, what are some of the most significant changes that you have seen, especially, I think Dr. Apkowitz certainly touched on GIS, and we know that that's a huge field and a big part of your work as well.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I don't know if I can answer any better than Mark. That was an excellent answer. I think definitely I'll piggyback a bit on the GIS component there, since that's mostly what I teach here at GIS, is a variety of usually graduate level GIS classes or something that uses GIS. And so I've been using GIS now. I took my first GIS class 14 years ago, so I'm about right at that 15-year mark. So I think I have definitely seen that field evolve, and of course I'm looking at climate and hazards, but I also always come back to the data and how we analyze those data, and it almost always comes back to the use of GIS. And GIS has evolved so much since I started using it in undergrad, to the point now where it's a fun struggle to keep up with everything that changes every semester. I always have to update my labs and the information I look at, and even looking at students that do their master's thesis and they graduate recently. A year later, I'm like, oh, we should have done it this way, or now there's a tool that instead of spending 3 months doing that, we could do it in 3 days. And so, I think those are really powerful trends in the GIS world. And Tennessee has a really good GIS community, and it's very well plugged in to the emergency management side. And some of the biggest things that we do, especially in the GAD lab, but also what we want to do at the climate office, is create data-driven hazard mitigation plans, kind of with GIS as the backbone of creating that and managing the data, analyzing the data, but also providing that data. And we talked about communication, getting information out to a wider audience, web mapping, story maps, dashboards. We've seen tons of dashboards this year related to the COVID pandemic. We, of course, saw the one coming out of Johns Hopkins, which was is an excellent dashboard that communicated pretty effectively what's going on to a really wide audience. It's probably one of the most clicked on websites this entire year, would be my guess. And so we actually, in our geomatics and disaster science lab, we created a statewide and a regional dashboard for COVID-19 as well. We have a variety of information on there. We actually worked with our local emergency manager on that. We were looking at, long term, how do we use it? We've never been faced with this type of pandemic where it's had this big of an impact. Oftentimes, at least on the hazard mitigation planning, technically communicable diseases is part of the Tennessee hazard mitigation plan, and it's in there. We have recognized that it can be an issue, but we've never had basically this giant of an exercise in what are the real impacts. And so I think there's a lot to look at this year with, and this is kind of going into one of the other questions. I won't go too much into this, but it's, looking at how can we use some of these evolving technologies to increase awareness for people, to provide that information, and to think through business continuity and hazard mitigation planning. We usually think of hazard mitigation planning as natural hazards, and pandemics you can say are natural or anthropogenic. There's various kind of states of thought there, but they have a big impact. And how can we use the tools we have now and the evolution of those tools to think about going forward? How do we prepare ourselves for that? And I think that every county, every city across the state has really involved in their use of that technology, and it's created a much larger increase in awareness, I think, for folks on resiliency, on mitigation, on adaptation. All of these areas have benefited from that. But you mentioned earlier the idea of too much data, and I think that can be a real problem too. And so I think it's important for us maybe on the research side or the services side to synthesize those data to make them more understandable as well.
Thank you. I think that's one of the greatest areas that I have relied on GIS experts during the response, even now, is being able to help me distill tons of data into a more palatable, chewable bites in the form of dashboards. One of the, we had a private sector request of the fuel industry and others and retail industry were trying to manage all the different executive orders, all the mask mandates, and for the different counties, and trying to keep up with that with 95 different counties across the state is near impossible. And it's ever changing. Things were getting updated. Things are changing. So one of the TEMA GIS folks here over at TEMA came up with a countywide map that keeps updated, thankfully, all the county level executive orders and mask mandates, and that is something that we were able to send out to the private sector so that they can keep up with that. And when you've got a business operating in multiple counties all over the state with different levels of response going on, you need that information and you need it fast. And that helps. That's been a great way I have seen dashboards like that in GIS directly implemented. We also use a lot of that information for all critical infrastructure information. The amount of information in just doing this side of it the last 5 years that I can get at a moment's notice compared to even just 4 years ago, and what was available and I would need in an emergency and when we had a fuel shortage. So it's those quick snapshots that GIS provide us never go unappreciated or underutilized, really. It's more, how can we find the time to use all the benefit that we get from it? So I think that's a workforce development thing also, that everyone needs to know a little bit of GIS, even if it's just awareness, and how that you, for me, it's like cybersecurity. I don't need to know how to hack something. What I need to know is, what do I need to know when it happens? What do I need to know to not contribute to it happening? But do I need to be the person that's responding or coding to it? Absolutely not. That's for job for somebody like Tiffany and who I need to call. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Tiffany, and same question to you of what do you see are some of the biggest advancements in your career and significant things and have been the biggest impacts for you?
Well, taking from what you said, Ben, that's what for me is one of the greatest advancements that I've seen, even in the past 5 years, is communication of threat intelligence relating to cybersecurity, specific to transportation, specific to not just the U.S. Department of Transportation on a federal level, but down on the state and county levels, being able to get the information to who needs to know it and then set up a framework. Really, I'd worked on a project a few years ago where we took the big, cybersecurity framework that was created by NIST. It was created to be rather not industry specific, but we wanted to make it more specific to transportation. So what we did is we started really not rewriting it, but making specific recommendations of what to do when this happens, who to call when this happens, when to get law enforcement involved, because some of the state DOTs, this is one of the things that they said was very important. Education was number one. The second was get the information to us in a way that's useful. And then if you could create a format, or, a framework that we could follow for what we could do to respond to this. And then even the framework even goes even further just after response, kind of afterwards, learning from, lessons learned type of thing to teach so it doesn't happen again. But what I have enjoyed seeing in the past 5 years is so much more communication. For example, there was not a case, but there was an example I have where I worked on the gantries above highways, which are part of critical infrastructure, part of transportation security, were getting hacked by someone. A hacker was leaving his handle. This sign is hacked by this hacker. Now, this hacker figured out in one state he could get into a unit that had a vulnerability that the vendor didn't know about. He could get into it remotely, and then he could actually pass it on to like 5 or 6 different states. And his sign was appearing on gantryways over I-95 and very big transportation hubs. And U.S. Department of Transportation was on that immediately. But what we learned from that was he was a gentleman at U.S. Department of Transportation was having to email state DOTs, hey, if you have this is a vulnerability, and here's a recommendation for a patch. But he was having to send individual emails. He was on the phone. And after that, he realized that there must be a more efficient way to get this information of threat intelligence to all of you that need it quickly. And even for the states that weren't affected, they might not have been accessed by this particular hacker. But it was a really big concern because so much is connected. And the communication, not just amongst like US DOT down to the state and local DOTs, but also with the vendors of the systems you use. The communication about vulnerabilities they might find in like traffic light, and signaling. Being able to find out which clients for US DOT has these models and what might be a patch for these, being able to get that information out quickly, even before something happens. Sometimes what it takes is as a hacker exposing a vulnerability, exploiting it, and then they know. But if security researchers are able to feel comfortable going to the vendor or going to US DOT or US CERT and saying, we found these vulnerabilities, please pass this on to anyone who might be affected. Making that communications channel more activate quickly because some of these are related to critical infrastructure. They're protected. Those gantry signs were very important not to be hackable. They're being able to get all the information out and have the vendors talk to the government and the government talk to the vendors. There's been a great deal more communication in the past even 5 years than I saw 15 years ago when I was in this industry. It was very hard to get anyone to talk to anyone because you didn't want to, sometimes the vendor didn't want the government to know that they had a vulnerability, or it was very difficult to fix, or it was going to take them a long time. Now, I think with some of the laws associated with, if there are breaches associated with different types of people's PII, there are breach laws where you have to start telling consumers, you have to let people know there have been problems. That kind of thing hasn't quite reached the level of with vendors, with products, with if they know there's a problem, they don't have to tell clients immediately, but creating a safe and comfortable communications network where they don't worry about, for instance, other liability aspects, but feel comfortable saying, we want to help you fix this before there's a problem. That's improving. But 15 years ago, it was not in a good state at all. No one wanted to expose themselves to liability, but the communication is helping, and it's getting better. So we still have a ways to go, but I have seen a great deal of improvement in my career over that.
I've seen that as well with just communications and the trust that it just takes time. It's like any good relationship. It takes time. It takes getting to know each other, working together, and building that trust so that in a situation, especially when it comes between government and private sector. And there are times it's hard for, especially outside folks, a lot of times to understand with cybersecurity incidences that the FBI needs to be notified, is rightfully notified. And then at that point, usually the company or even the government involved, the governmental body involved, can't communicate outside of there. And so then it becomes sort of a tricky situation in that the state wants to help a local with their situation and the cybersecurity incident that they're going through, but in the same breath, they may be in a position where they cannot communicate to us what's going on. So that's part of why there's multiple communication angles and lanes of what is the threat, what do we think it might be. I used the example of I had heard there was a water system that had been compromised by ransomware. So while we didn't know what the specific threat was, we knew the nature of it. So we had our water inspectors just ask broadly, is everything okay? Do you need help with anything? Are your systems okay? You know, it wasn't a regulatory function. It was just a general, we're here, we're a resource. You know, if there's an emergency that you need help dealing with, we're here. And you know, that's where that starts, because at that point, we don't know if the local system or the local government is overwhelmed. And as a state, then it is our function to help supplement that if they need that help. So I think that's one of the ways we've even tried now during disasters to communicate when we hear, for instance, a system's had to go on backup generator. Then if we hear one of those systems has gone on a backup generator, we go, okay, let's remember that. And so then the post-disaster, when you get that post-disaster mitigation funding, go, let's make sure that's up to date. Let's make sure it's secure. Let's make sure you're not still using an old system, an old version of Windows that's maybe out of date, because we all forget in the beautiful cyber age that we live in, an internet information age where we're able to have virtual panels like this. We forget there are still systems out there, water systems, for instance, that I went to one that there was not a single internet connection in the building. They didn't need it. Their operating systems, and from a security standpoint, that's great. Their operating system was completely off the grid. It wasn't vulnerable for the most part. And so that was great, but in the same breath, it made it hard for them to make sure everything was updated and connected and still ran the way it did. There was a way that we helped them work out getting those things upgraded, even though they didn't have a connection at the time. But that's something, especially inside the Beltway, with some of the folks that I deal with up there in DC, that's easy to forget sometimes, because we're all very fortunate to have the systems and the good connections and the good internet that we have to have video conferencing. And that's not the truth. That's not the reality for a lot of our rural folks, that in fact, in a lot of ways, that leaves them more vulnerable to attacks and hacks and other things, because they don't have the personnel, the resources, or necessarily the time to keep things upgraded and secure and have the good fortune to listen to panels like this. So thank you for that insight. That was excellent and very true. And as I suspected, all three of you have seen great changes and great innovations as well. And that's one of the exciting things about this topic to me. We do have some questions for the audience. There's one very specific one that I admit this goes outside my technical expertise, but I do want to see what, I have a feeling you all are going to know what this addresses, and I never am afraid to say I don't know. So this is one I want to see what y'all might know and related to this. The question was, I'm curious if the panel can provide insight into the DSRC versus CV2X discusussion in the recent FCC note on DSRC rules. DSRC is being displaced while many projects are still in development. And so if that's an area that y'all have insight in, certainly just jump in and provide the answer. It may be so specific that it's really a transportation planner question. Or maybe like the old game show when we stump the panel.
Okay, so I think that this might relate to some of the work that I did a while ago, but this had to do with vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. So the question was about it being phased out or being changed for a different type of technology. Is that correct, Ben?
Yes. The DSRC being displaced with some of the new rules.
I must admit, I know what the question's about. I don't know enough about the new rules to answer that question about that, because when I did do this work back in 2012 for a defense contractor, it was just, we thought the DSRC was going to be the technology that was going to be there for a while, at least a decade or two. But yeah, so unless there's more information about specific rules, so I'll acknowledge I know what you're talking about, but I don't have the expertise to answer that specific question.
Well, with that, I think we'll stop there, and we are encroaching almost to 3 o'clock, and I think there was some popcorn questions that Jacqueline, you wanted to ask real quick, and I think I took a few of your minutes there, which I apologize. I wanted to get at least one of the audience questions. We had so much, it's like most good panels, you never have enough time and more questions than you have time. So with Jacqueline, I will surrender it back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ben, Mark, Andrew, and Tiffany for that terrifically insightful and timely discussion. We are at time, so I'm going to yield my time. I'd love to ask you those questions, but I think our conversation today was robust and perfect as is. So I want to thank our audience also and our forum organizers from the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, the Tennessee Department of Transportation, and Tennessee Clean Fuels Coalition for attending today's webinar. We hope that you join us for the rest of this 4-part Sustainable Transportation webinar series. The last webinar session will be November 17th, same time, same platform. And the webinar registration information is once again posted in the chat box for your convenience. We also have a SurveyMonkey link in the chat box that takes you to a quick 3-question survey regarding today's topics and speakers, and your feedback greatly helps us shape next year's event. So thanks in advance for completing that survey. And with that, this webinar is adjourned. So have a terrific and safe day and week this week. And we appreciate your participation.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and to all of our office, TDOT and OEP for getting this together and bringing all these panelists together. Really appreciate it. It was a great panel.